The Rainbow Book
Right.
Club invites you to the maiden edition of Talking Books Africa, our monthly virtual live conversation with authors to mark Port Harcourt's 10th anniversary as UNESCO World Book Capital. Join us on Saturday, 20th of April 2024, 6 to 7 p.m. for an interview with Chibundu Onuzo, a Rainbow Book Club and Hay Festival Africa 39 author. We will also be discussing her latest book, Sankofa. Connect with us on our social media platforms as we bring Africa's stories to the world. Rainbow Book Club, spreading the joy of reading since 2005.
Okay. All right. Welcome, everyone. Good afternoon and good evening, depending on where you're joining us from today. You're welcome to the Rainbow Book Club Talking Books Africa series. It's actually the inaugural session today. So you're all welcome. Please let's know where you're joining from in the comments. Let's know where you're joining from today in the comments. Let's know your name. Let's get to meet you. And let's also know if this is your first time being on any of the programs of Rainbow Book Club. Would like to thank you so much for joining today. Such a pleasure to have you here with us. And I'm not going to waste too much time. I will be going straight into some very interesting introductions today. We have a wonderful speaker here who is going to be sharing about her book, and we have an amazing interviewer also here with us today. So welcome. Would like to encourage you to share this with your friends. Promises to be an exciting edition of the Talking Books Africa. And we like to say that Talking Books Africa is about sharing or telling our own stories to the rest of the world, telling our own stories to the rest of the world. Okay, all right. So a little bit about Talking Books, Rainbow Book Club, because Rainbow Book Club is actually an organization that was founded by Mrs. Kalango. And you can see, you'll probably get to hear from her shortly on this call. Mrs. Kalango founded Rainbow Book Club a number of years ago and actually has been able to accomplish something really amazing, and that's hosting the World Book Capital. Hosting the World Book Capital here in Nigeria. Yes, you heard it. That prestigious event was hosted here in 2014, here in Nigeria, in the city of Port Harcourt. And so this year, being 2024, marks the 10th anniversary, and it's in commemoration of that we're having the Talking Book Africa series. And this is the first edition, and so it's a pleasure to have you here. Rainbow Book Club has done so much in promoting a reading culture in Africa, not just in Africa, but even beyond the world. There have been opportunities to represent Nigeria across different cities of the world. And Rainbow continues to promote that culture, especially in secondary and primary education. Many distinguished individuals in government and private sector have partnered with Rainbow Book Club over the years, from past presidents to diplomats to name them, accomplished authors and speakers. So many of them have been able to grace this platform, and we're happy to speak about that. So I won't waste much time. I'm not the one who is going to be doing a lot of the talking today. I have somebody who you can see, or you will be seeing shortly on your screen once she's spotlighted. She's the one who's going to be interviewing our guest author today. And we also have our guest author on the call. Now, our interviewer is Tarari Kalango. She's an international development professional with a passion for Africa. When she's not improving access to loans for small, medium enterprise businesses in Africa, you can find her on her nose buried in a novel by an African author. In her spare time, Tarari writes. She's based in Washington, D.C., USA. So you see that we had the perfect person to be interviewing our guest author today because Tarari is a writer herself and she loves to read when she's not working. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce our guest author to you. We're going to be having a conversation with her in the next few moments, and her name is none other than Chibundu Onuzo. Chibundu Onuzo was born in Lagos, Nigeria, and lives in London. She's a fellow of the Royal Society of Literature and a regular contributor to The Guardian. She's also the winner of a Betty Trask Award, and she's been shortlisted for the Dylan Thomas Prize, the Commonwealth Book Prize, and the RSL Encore Award. And she's been shortlisted for the Desmond Elliott Prize and a Tesseract Literature Prize. A lot of accolades here. Chibundu was a guest author at the Rainbow Book Club's Garden City Literary Festival in Port Harcourt in 2012. She's also one of the Rainbow Book Club and Hay Festival Africa 39 authors. Sankofa, which she's going to be speaking about today, is actually her third novel. She has quite a number of novels in her bag. She is an accomplished author, and we're proud she's African. She is African, even though she's joining from London today. And you can see the wonderful paintings right behind her that also reinforce her Africanness. Now, without wasting much time, I will hand over to the delectable Tarari, who will be asking questions and having a discussion with our guest author today. For those of you joining, please feel free to prepare your questions because we will have time in a few moments to take questions from you, as we would love this to be interactive. Once again, we want to say welcome. Over to you, Tarari.
Thank you, Osarume, for the very flattering introduction. I'm sure Chibundu would say the same. I would like to welcome everyone to the first edition of Talking Books Africa by the Rainbow Book Club. And obviously to welcome our guest author today, Chibundu. Thank you so much for joining us. I personally have read all of your books, probably more than once. So I'm really looking forward to this conversation and just to picking your brain on Sankofa.
Great. Thank you for having me here. Nice to be here. Thank you, Osarume, for the flattering introduction. I'm glad you find my painting suitably African. That's why I sat here just for you.
Great. So let's get started. To kick us off, I will read a quick review of Sankofa that was written by Roving Heights, just to introduce to the book those who may not be familiar with it. So Anna Graham is at a stage of her life when she's beginning to wonder who she really is. She has separated from her husband. Her daughter is all grown up, and her mother, the only parent who raised her, is dead. Searching through her mother's belongings, she finds clues about the West African father she never knew. Through reading his student diary, chronicling his involvement in radical politics in 1960s London, she discovers that he eventually became the president, some would say dictator, of a small nation in West Africa, and he is still alive. She decides to track him down, and so begins a funny, painful, fascinating journey and an exploration of race, identity, and what we pass on to our children. So I will get right into it and start off by asking a question which I feel I must ask, because whenever I'm reading a novel, I'm always trying to find parts of the author in it. I don't know if anyone else does this, but I'm trying to see what part of themselves have they reflected in this writing. And as the review mentioned, identity is a big theme in Sankofa. So Chibundu, I was really curious to know if there's any way in which you as an individual relates to Anna's search for identity, and if you did draw upon a part of yourself for that, which part was it?
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad you honed in on identity to ask if that was autobiographical. I have had some interviews where people ask if my father is the dictator of an African country. And I have to ask, like, what are you even thinking about? Of course not. So I didn't draw on personal experiences to write Sankofa, not really. So I grew up in Nigeria and I lived there till I was a teenager before I moved to England. And so I don't necessarily feel like my Nigerian identity is in question. I don't think it's something that's contested.
Mm-hmm.
But moving here, you do meet a lot of people who are of Nigerian heritage. So whether their parents are Nigerian or they have some sort of Nigerian or even African ancestry, where because they've grown up here, technically they're British. This is the only country they've lived in. But then there's that thing of people will ask you, where are you really from? If you say you're from England or if you say you're from Britain. And I mean, I get asked, where am I really from as well? But I don't take offense at that. I'm very happy to say Nigeria. I'm from Nigeria. End of conversation is okay. But if you haven't grown up in Nigeria or grown up in Ghana or wherever, it can be a more contested issue. And in particular, my main character, Anna, is biracial. And so that is also like something that comes up particularly with the biracial community in the diaspora, where people often try to make people who are biracial choose. And usually, if they are Black as well, it's like the Black side of them. So Anna grows up with her white mother, but she's never seen as white. It's sort of like the way race doesn't really make sense. So if you have one Black parent and one white parent, then people just don't think of you as white. But she doesn't grow up around Black people. So there's a quest for identity that she has while she's living in the UK. And she thinks those questions will be answered by going to Bamana. But then when she gets there, and again, of course, you see this as well in Nigeria, people who are biracial, people call them Oibo or people call them Obroni. So again, she comes to Africa and then there's that feeling of, oh, I thought this was where I would be able to slot in and be just part of the crowd. And that's not the same for her. So I met a lot of people who had this sort of experiences basically. And so that informed Anna's quest for identity.
Yeah, so though it wasn't based on your personal experiences, it was based on, I guess, real life experiences of others. And I think one thing that I've noticed, because I guess I made a similar journey to yourself in the sense of growing up in Nigeria and then moving over to the UK at some point, is that race was something that in some ways I discovered when I left Nigeria. When you're in a place where everybody looks like you, has the same skin tone, you don't really think about it much, or you don't think about the implications, or you don't sort of identify and categorize yourself as Black. And then, you go abroad and it's a different story outside. And what you said about Anna searching for identity and thinking that she'll find it in Bamana I think is something that's so interesting about the book, and we'll definitely get to that later. But I did want to ask, again, like we said, this is not an experience that you had firsthand, but you chose to write about it. Something else that I don't believe is an experience you've had firsthand, but you've written Sankofa in this way, is writing about Africa from an outsider's perspective. And in many ways, Sankofa shares similarities with your other novels, The Spider King's Daughter and Welcome to Lagos. But I think this is one way in which I noticed it was starkly different. As in the first two, we're reading about Nigeria, so Africa in particular, but Nigeria through the eyes of Nigerians. Whereas in Sankofa, when we're introduced to Africa, to the West African nation of Bamana, it's through the eyes of an outsider. And I certainly felt at times reading the novel almost wanting to correct Anna, or wanting to like jump in and say, oh no, this is not, this is a generalization about Africans. This is a Western idea. You've got it all wrong, sort of thing. So I really wanted to hear from you what it was like to be writing about Africa from an outsider's perspective.
I I mean, yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, to pick up on something you said before you asked the question, that sort of growing up in Nigeria, like, you sort of discovered race um when you came to England, and that sort of everybody looked like you. I don't think that was definitely not the case for me. It's not so much that everybody looked like you. I think we still understand, or we still can see differences in skin tone or gradations in skin tone. Like, the yellow people were called Oyibo Pepe or yellow pawpaw or whatever. It's just that those differences in skin tone, they don't mean the same thing that they mean in sort of like a Western context. And like also even just like a sense of alienation, you can also feel that in Nigeria. It's just not based on race. So there are other things that human beings used to divide themselves. So of course, in the Nigerian context, it's tribe. So my mom is Yoruba and my dad is Igbo. So I mean, it's not the same as being biracial, but I can understand that experience because in a similar context in Nigeria, you're often asked to choose, yeah, where your daddy is from, or yeah, where you're this, or like, so some people just still cannot get their head round how I can have a Yoruba name. It's like, what is the meaning of this? Who did this? I'm like, have you heard of marriage? Have you heard? Why is this so confusing to you? So there's I think there are experiences that are not the same as race, but that we have in a Nigerian context that can also inform sort of understanding that quest for identity that Anna has. And then as to writing about from the outsider's perspective, I think it was fun to write from that perspective and to write as a tourist. And yes, of course, Anna gets things wrong and she comes with her perspective and her prejudice and
Her Obroni privilege.
yes, exactly. She comes with her privilege. Yes, exactly. She does come with her privilege. But then at the same time, because I'm also interested in, again, I don't feel like it's such a leap. So I'm not saying that being a wealthy Nigerian is the same as being a white person in visiting an African country. But again, I think wealth is also its own sort of lens and bias. And again, you can use that to sort of inform how Anna looks at the world and who she wants to associate with when she goes to Bamana. And yeah, I think, yes, her race is a bubble, but also her wealth and her privilege is also a bubble. And so, yes, these two things.
Well, that's certainly an angle that I've never thought of it through. I mean, the part about wealth and how that's a bubble, but also what you said about how we also have these sort of distinctions and divides in Africa. They may not be race, which is, what's the hot topic on the global scene, but I think as Mrs. Kalango has said a couple of times, wherever you have a majority and a minority, you would always find sort of, prejudice and biases that we just see maybe more pronounced in some places than others. But anyway, to go on, you said that it was fun to write about Africa from an outsider's perspective. Another difference that Sankofa has from your other two books is that it's based in a different West African country. So the fictional country of Bamana, but really seeming to have a lot of cultural ties to Ghana in some of the names and some of the language. So what was it like for you to be sort of going outside of your comfort zone, if it was outside your comfort zone, to be writing about Ghanaian culture rather than Nigerian?
I mean, some people were really irritated by the fact that I didn't base it on Ghana. So they felt like I sort of like appropriated or like ripped off Ghana. And like, I don't know, like I was just like, okay, fine. That's that's your opinion, and you are very welcome to have it.
Yeah.
But why I did it, why I based on a fictional country was just for the very reason that I am not Ghanaian. And I didn't want any Ghanaian brethren to come and tell me I've gotten this wrong, and I've gotten that wrong, and I've gotten this wrong. I said, I'm going to make up my own country and just fictionally help. I guess, so that that's like the glib sort of surface reason. But also because the colonial boundaries in West Africa, they're arbitrary. So like you have Yoruba people in Benin Republic and you have Yoruba people in Nigeria. And so somebody just drew a line and grouped this country together. And so like Bamana is a country that very well could exist if somebody had drawn a different line on the map of West Africa. And so like it is sort of based in reality. And so for example, Ghana is a pre-colonial West Africa. The name Ghana is from a pre-colonial West African kingdom that is not where present-day Ghana is situated. And so the name Bamana again is from a pre-colonial West African kingdom. And so yes, I did sort of draw a lot on African history and how the present-day nations that we know, how they came to be. So, Bamana was called in the book, it was called the Diamond Coast. And again, with, colonial powers, they named their colonies after the natural resources that they got from them. Hence, Ivory Coast today is still Ivory Coast because they got ivory from there. So Ghana used to be called Gold Coast. They changed their name. Nigeria, we didn't change our name. I was watching this documentary on Netflix. I don't know how accurate, but a historian posited that Nigeria, the origins of the name Nigeria are not positive at all. That it's from the N word, basically. According to him, like, so this was his own research. But I think we should probably change our name as well. We should do a Ghana and change our name. So yes, I just drew on a lot of history to create this sort of fictional country of Bamana. And I guess also I didn't want to pin it down to a real place because the story of Bamana is the story of many African countries, that there was a lot of optimism around independence, and our founding fathers, or whatever I want to call them, heroes of independence or whatever, they promised heaven and earth, and everybody believed that they were going to give heaven and earth, and they did not give heaven, they did not give earth, and in fact, maybe some people will say they gave hell because looking at what some of the countries look like. And so it's not a story about Ghana or a story about Nigeria or Tanzania or wherever. It's a story that, you can look at many African countries and say, yes, they followed this trajectory. And lastly, I didn't want to set it in Ghana because once you say the first Prime Minister of Ghana, you think Kwame Nkrumah. He's just such a big figure in the African imagination, and not just African, Pan-African, the African diaspora. Like Nkrumah is one of those people that he's a surname person. You say Nkrumah, Mandela, like, people you don't call their first name, you just call their surname and you know who you're talking about. So like, again, if I set the country, if I just set the book in Ghana, once I say Kofi Adjei is the first Prime Minister of Ghana, it's not possible. Nkrumah is the first Prime Minister of Ghana. For all these reasons, and also because I didn't want the Ghanaians to come for me and say, you got that wrong, and you got that wrong. Yes, Bamana became Bamana.
It's so interesting that, in trying to avoid a bit of that pushback from the community, you got a different type of pushback with people saying you're appropriating the culture. It sort of feels like you can't win. You can't get it.
People will always push you. So you have to decide in life what you want to do. So at least when they push you, you say, well, I did it with my chest.
I like that. And that's some life advice for all of us on this call. In your response, I really like how you sort of spoke about not wanting to write about Ghana as well, because you're telling the story of Africa, right? And because that was one of the things that I wanted to ask, reading Sankofa, reading about Francis Agri's journey to becoming Kofi Adjei. I hope I've pronounced his name right. Hopefully the Ghanaians won't come for me too. But it just, you're sort of sadly shaking your head because it reads like so many other stories of real people that we know in Africa. It's very familiar, I would say, to Africans. And so I wanted to know whether there was any sort of political statement that you were trying to make, in chronicling this story. Of course, with writing, you don't a novel is never going to be one-dimensional, or a good novel rather shouldn't be one-dimensional. So it's natural to involve those different elements. But whether for you it was almost like a conscious decision, because Anna's father could have been anybody, but you made him a prime minister and then a dictator of an African country. Was there a statement you wanted to make with that?
I mean, so it's very interesting when you write a novel, there's so many things that inform the story. So the first seed for Sankofa was planted when my friend Joseph Harker, who the book is dedicated to, he has a story almost identical to Anna's. And like, I'm not sort of sharing any family secrets because we did an event in London where he spoke about this and all of that. So it's out in the public. But his father was a Nigerian man who came to England as a student, had an affair with his white mother, went back to Nigeria, and was never seen or heard from again. And Joseph, in his 20s, decided to go to Nigeria on his own steam, didn't know anybody in Nigeria, decided to go to Nigeria to look for his father. And then, you know, the adventure story continued from there. And so this is somebody I know, this was his life story. And I think if I had just heard his story, Anna's father in the book may just have gone back to Nigeria and, you know, become a lawyer, become a doctor, you know, something like that. However, I was also doing a PhD on the West African Students' Union when I heard this story. So the West African Students' Union was a students group that was based in London from 1925 to 1970. And a lot of its members went on to become key political figures in West Africa. So most famously, Kwame Nkrumah was the vice president of the West African Students' Union when he was a student in London. And so I was reading about the stories and the testimonies and the diaries and all of that of these students that had started off in London, fairly penniless, but very ambitious. And they had that sort of sense of calling that we are, and just as I detailed in the book, we are the ones that are going to go home and change Africa and this is that and the other. So they had that real sense of mission and sense of calling. And it was interesting to contrast with myself. You know, I was in London with other West African students and like, what are we interested in? We're interested in like ACS and party and
having a good time.
exactly, in having a good time. And you know, I mean every once in a while, you know, like maybe there'll be some, I don't know, international development thing or whatever. But by and large, we're just there for a good time. Whereas these guys were very much, they had a real sense of mission. It was almost like religious, their sort of sense of like, we are the ones that are going to change things. So I think that, so Joseph gave me the personal angle into this story, into this political story that I was coming across in my research for my PhD. And again, what's very interesting when you're doing a PhD and in academic papers is that you can't write anything, as a historian, you can't write anything that the documents don't show. So in that sense, history can be quite limiting. So you come across a little snippet of information and you want to find out more about it and you want to write more about it, but the people involved are dead, their friends are dead, everybody's dead. Like that's just the end of the story. And there was one snippet like this I came across. So Joe Appiah, who was a Ghanaian politician as well, a very prominent opposition politician, he was best friends with Kwame Nkrumah. Well, one of his, according to him, they were best friends. Who knows? They were very close friends, Sha, when they were in London together as students. And now Kwame Nkrumah was coming from the American South, where he had done his previous degrees. And in the South, a Black man could not be seen talking to, having a friendship with, having a romantic relationship with, you know, a white woman. Like you could risk being lynched, or, you know, it could be a very serious affair. So Kwame Nkrumah comes to London, and according to Joe Appiah, Kwame Nkrumah is afraid of white women because of what he's experienced in America, in the American South. And so Joe Appiah takes this upon himself to find Kwame Nkrumah a white girlfriend. This is according to Joe Appiah. I mean, you cannot even see Kwame. You can't hear Kwame. All parties are dead. All the parties described as dead. So Joe Appiah takes it upon himself to find Kwame Nkrumah a white girlfriend, and he finds Kwame Nkrumah a white girlfriend. And the story goes on. And this story is only like a paragraph or 2 paragraphs in his memoir. And then everything else is politics, 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 nationalism, nationalism. And I'm like, hold up, please, I want to know more about Kwame Nkrumah's white girlfriend. Please, I want to know more. And I suppose this is where the novelist again sort of steps in and is like, what would it have been like? You know, and you sort of want to fill in those details. And as a historian, you can't if you don't have the data, you just don't have the data. And so again, it was stories like this that sort of informed what you saw in Sankofa, like yeah, basically.
Wow. Yeah, I imagine that must be an interesting line for you to walk, having to take off your writer hat and put on your historian hat and then switch and keep them distinct for, purposes of accuracy in your academic work. But thank God for that. Otherwise, we may not have had Sankofa,
Well, yes,
which
exactly.
I'm sure is much more interesting than whatever the historical version was. Okay, so so many questions that I still want to ask, but I'm going to try to keep myself to maybe another 2 before we open up the floor to hear from our audience. So we spoke about how Sankofa is similar or how it's different to your previous novels. I think besides the location, there was a big difference that stood out to me, which was the almost fantastical or fantasy-like element that we get in Sankofa a bit towards the end. Hopefully not spoiling it for anyone who hasn't read it, which was something that we hadn't seen beforehand. And it seems like it may have been a bit of a turning point for you because your latest book, which is Maiwa and the Sea of Words, which is for children, is also a fantasy, or I don't know if that's the correct category, but I would call it a fantasy piece of work, at least in part. So I'm curious to know whether we can expect more of this type of writing from you, if it represents a bit of a shift in where your mind is at as an author or not.
I mean, that's very astute sort of readership. It's not something that you do consciously. It's not something I do consciously. Sort of like adding that fantasy element in. And it wasn't the original ending of Sankofa. So like in the first draft, I don't think that's where I ended the book. And why it seemed like the natural conclusion to Anna's journey. And I think the thing with writing a book, the way I write is I don't plot things from beginning to end. So when I start a book, I don't necessarily know how it's going to end. I sort of have a rough idea of, like, for example, starting this book, I know I want Anna to go to Bamana and meet her father, but I don't necessarily know what's going to happen when she gets there. And I think as I was writing the book and writing a first draft and a second draft, I sort of realized that this is kind of a spiritual quest for her as well. It's not just sort of this searching for who I am and all of that. It's not just a thing about family trees, and so you can fill in names on a piece of paper and say, okay, this is my dad and this is his mom and all of that. There's just something spiritual about it. And again, watching videos and reading accounts of African Americans and people in the diaspora who had gone back to the slave forts, where their ancestors or some of their ancestors might have been taken. Again, if you watch this account, there's often like a spiritual kind of energy or something around it. And I mean, I sort of allude to that when Anna goes to the slave fort for the first time and they sing Swing Low, Sweet Chariot or something like that. And the African Americans who are on the tour start having a sort of spiritual experience, but then Anna doesn't have access to it, or she feels she doesn't have access to it because her ancestors were not slaves. And so she's like, they've come and they've had this closure and they've had this moment. And again, what's interesting is I contrast Anna's reaction with also the reaction of the other Africans who go to the slave fought, for whom, like, oh, it's just like a picnic. Like, we were just here on a date, like, take pictures. And like the African Americans are like groaning and singing and wailing, and they're like, oh, please snap me. And so Anna doesn't have that experience. And I think her journey for her, it's not going to feel complete until she has some sort of transcendental something. And I sort of leave it open to the reader to decide whether what she's experiencing is real or not. And so like, if you're somebody that believes in spiritual experiences, that you'd be like, yeah, that's happening. If you're somebody that doesn't, you're like, she's high. There's some drugs. They put some, some drugs in the smoke, and yeah, she's just high. So I've left it open-ended.
Yeah, that's interesting. I definitely was one of the readers who took it literally. Maybe that's because I do believe in spiritual experiences.
Yes,
I was
exactly.
like, oh yeah, this definitely happened, and she's changed afterwards, and she's at peace with who she is. But up to interpretation. Up to interpretation. Gosh, I had a question on the tip.
Oh yeah, you asked me about moving forward into fantasy. Yes, interesting actually. I think I don't know what it was. Maybe me too. I had a spiritual experience when I wrote Sankofa too. And at the end, I was like, yes, now I can write fantastical things. I have enjoyed writing my children's book because, there's a little bit of fantasy in Sankofa, but in a children's book, you're sort of you're free, your imagination sort of breaks open. And that has also been enjoyable. Like it's been more like play for me than a serious, like an adult novel.
Oh. Well, I'm looking forward to reading that. For those who don't know, I believe it's coming out this summer, but you can sort of Google it and pre-order it. Please do pre-order Myla and the Sea of Words. Okay, so I'm going to ask one more question before I hand over to the audience so they can ask theirs. And it's, we've just spoken about sort of this shift in you as an author. You're now writing your first children's book. And so I'd like to take you back maybe a decade, or more than a decade rather, since you've had an ongoing relationship with the Rainbow Book Club since that time. And when the Rainbow Book Club had its Garden City Literary Festival in 2012, the 2012 edition, you were actually one of the authors that was featured there. I think it was the Spider King's daughter. I would have been the Spider King's daughter, and you would have been maybe fresh out of uni or something. I don't know. So if you do remember that event and experience at all, what was that like for you? And what I guess, how have you grown or changed as an author since then?
Of course, I remember that experience. It was my first international trip as an author. Hey, I've arrived. They paid for my plane ticket. Are you kidding? Of course, I remember. Like, don't talk to me anyhow. My level has changed. I'm now international. I've blown. Yes, my first international experience. My first trip to Port Harcourt. And it was all sort of being a published writer and all of that. It was all still very new for me. So I'd had a lot of press in the UK, but as I said, it was like my first international trip. Like I was 2012 would make me 21 or something. Like I was young. My mom came with me. I had a chaperone to make sure that I don't lost in Port Harcourt. Hey. It was a big thing. I remember we stayed in this hotel, this big, I can't remember what was the name of the hotel.
I want to say presidential.
Yes, it was probably presidential, like big hotel. And then like one day, because we had a lot of events. I think we had things with school children. We had like things in the conference center. It was like a very robust experience of Port Harcourt, but we didn't really leave the hotel. So I think one of the authors that was based in Nigeria, but was also invited for the festival, was like, you can't come to Port Harcourt and just stay in the hotel. You have to see Port Harcourt. And so we went outside the hotel and we like ate like, roasted fish or something or this, that, and the other. And like, we went with some of the authors who were like Caucasian. And this was the time when like, kidnapping was on the rise. And it was like, hey, please don't, nobody should meet her. And But we shall ate the fish and we ate the bully and we ate it and we went back to the hotel and everything was fine. But I loved it. It was a fantastic experience. I really enjoyed, and I went twice. I went again for Africa 39. But the second time I'd gone, I thought I was more used to international travel. But like, oh no, it was a big deal. I said, they're paying for my meals, breakfast, lunch, dinner. Oh no. It was definitely one of the highlights of my career. So yes, shout out to Rainbow.
An internationally acclaimed author. I'm sure that you're not faced by those things anymore. I'm like, yeah, I'm just waiting for it. Where am I going to be staying? All those different things. Okay, well, I think I've taken up enough of the audience's time with my own questions, but thank you so much, Chibundu, for engaging. It's been wonderful speaking to you. And I believe I'm handing over to Osarumen now to go through some of the questions from our audience.
All right. Thank you, Tarari. I was actually going to allow you to do that since you've been having quite an interesting conversation with Chibundu, I beg your pardon. So happy for you to take it. I see some interesting questions already. So I think someone is pretty curious, Tarari, to know where Chibundu draws her inspiration. What sort of authors does she draw her inspiration from? I think I saw a question like that.
Okay.
Yes, let's start with that.
Okay. So it's interesting growing up in Nigeria. I'm looking back to our curriculum. I don't remember reading a lot of Nigerian books. It's been a while, so I can't remember too clearly, but I remember like in JS1, there was like Lamb's Tales by Shakespeare, and like what I remember reading in school, and then sort of younger, there were these Janet and John books with like the white children doing their thing. So I don't remember reading a lot of Nigerian authors when I lived in Nigeria. Again, in our primary school, the sort of books our parents bought for us, a lot of Enid Blyton. Again, I mean, we weren't allowed to read Harry Potter, but again, there are a lot of people reading Harry Potter, that sort of thing. And it wasn't until I moved to England that I started taking an interest in African literature. And I remember I read Things Fall Apart in England as a teenager. And I'd heard about the book in Nigeria. But it's part of the legacy of colonialism that a lot of times when you are a middle-class child or your parents are professionals growing up in Nigeria, a lot of times creatively you look to the West. So a lot of our TV especially was American. And so a lot of the creative work you consumed for us, I don't know what it's like for kids growing up in Nigeria now, but a lot of it came from overseas, from abroad. And it was only when I moved to England and then I read Things Fall Apart, that was sort of like my gateway into African fiction. And it was basically like, yes, I've been missing out. This is great. And this is not great because I'm African. This is just objectively great. This is literature. This is great characterization, great plotting. These are fantastic stories. And then also they are in a setting that you recognize and that you understand and that you don't need any explaining to. So you can enjoy it on two levels, just as a work of literature and then also as a work of literature that speaks directly to your experience. And so, yeah, that was eye-opening for me coming to England. And I mean, it's just the irony of it, sort of having to travel all the way to England to start reading African fiction, and not just to read it, but to also appreciate it. And like, again, growing up, there was that, Nigerian things are Raz or local, and everybody wants to, be forming and, speaking in accent and this, that, and the other, and packaging and all of that. And so, yes, you sort of, and I mean, now it's interesting to see Nigerians in the diaspora, those who've grown up here because of the rise of Afrobeats and all of that. Now everybody is now speaking one kind of pidgin. The same way we were forming English accent, now people are now forming pidgin. And the same way our own English accent was not making sense, it's also the way their own pidgin is now not making sense. But it's okay. All are welcome. All are welcome. But so yes, that's just and then of course from Chinua Achebe, I read, I remember Ake was a big favorite of mine as well. And then a little bit more contemporary, obviously, Purple Hibiscus, and then Sefi Atta, Everything Good Will Come. I honestly don't know what hold that book has over me. I read it almost once a year. And I did an interview where I mentioned it, and I was like, it's like a Bible to me. And then the journalist, which is why you have to be very careful in interviews. I shouldn't have said this now. Well, this is you have to be very careful in interviews, because then the journalist wrote, "Everything good will come is Chibundu's Bible." And I was like, okay, you need to calm down. I actually read the Bible. Okay. I said it's like. I said it's like. I did not say it is, simple grammar, simple first aid in English. But I read that book at least once a year. I think I just love the idea of following two friends, female friends, from their childhood to their adolescence to their first jobs to children to marriage to all of that. And it's so, so beautifully done. I love Everything Good Will Come. Everywhere I go, I always mention that book. And so many more. And then obviously my contemporaries as well, Ayobami Adebayo, Oyinkan Braithwaite. They're just so many, Emmanuel Iduma. And it's such an exciting space being a Nigerian author published here. When I was first published in 2012, every book by an African author I knew, as in, not that I knew the author, but I knew of the book. And then the other day, I saw a book. I said, this is an African name. This is Kenyan. I don't know who this person is. And they were published by like HarperCollins or like some big publisher in the UK. And I was like, wow, times have really changed. And I mean, it's let me not say it's bittersweet. It's great. You want the market to expand, but like those days of community where literally you all knew yourselves, because there's only like 2 of you published in the year, so you must know yourselves. So yeah, it's great to see like sort of like the spread, and yeah, just to try and support where I can.
And interesting, we actually have a question that sort of touches on this increase in interest in, Africa and how African things are becoming cool now, and not even just for the diaspora. I mean, I can't count the number of places I've been to in the Western world where you enter a store and they're playing Afrobeats music, Burna Boy, they love Rema, all these different artists. And so we've actually got someone asking that sort of with, I guess the rise in fame of a lot of Africans. We have Tunde Onakoya, who's just broken the Guinness World Book Records for the longest chess tournament. We have Pelumi, who drove from London to Nigeria. What do you think is the place of books like Sankofa, and how can they sort of contribute to, I guess, the sense of inspiration, right, around the world, or the sense of admiration for Nigeria, for Africa, especially by the diaspora, as you mentioned?
Okay, you guys, please, let's come together, please. What Guinness record can I break? They have done cooking, now they've done chess, and then Pelumi drove. Me, I cannot drive. Even to drive from London to Manchester, I don't want to do so. So let's all come together, please. Tell me what record I can break. I wrote, can I write a book in one day? Please, please, people, I'm actually being serious.
The longest writing. What do people think? Tell us in the chat.
What can, I don't know. Please tell me which, maybe, I'm lost. I cannot think of any Guinness record, but that's what is, yes, let me, so yes, all suggestions welcome.
Ready.
I mean, Sankofa, like what can Sankofa, longest reading marathon, like reading out loud. But I'm a singer, that's not very good for my voice, if I do this reading out loud.
Longest singing marathon?
Longest singing, I don't know. What about sleeping? Sleeping, longest sleeping, who is giving out the prize? Who's going to film me?
You might have a lot of contenders for that one.
Sankofa, like where does Sankofa fit into this like narrative of sort of like rising Africa and all of that? I mean, like, so personally, like it's good for me. I think before I think it's good to be in this space where there are a lot of eyeballs on Nigeria, African things. And like, personally for me, for Sankofa, like, I don't know if it was because I was Nigerian, but it was a Reese Witherspoon book club pick, and like it did really well, both in the UK, but especially in America. And I had this big billboard in Times Square, which sadly I didn't get to see because it was during the pandemic. But like that's personally good for me. But then I also know that with a lot of creative industries, sometimes these things can be cyclical. And so sometimes they can tend to be, oh, the flavor of the month. And so what you hope is that we capitalize on this moment. And I guess it's this sort of thing, and I haven't figured this out for myself, but how to make sure like we have some more ownership. So we're not just making the stuff and everybody, and then somebody else is sort of reaping most of the financial rewards. And I mean, I don't have any answers to this, but I definitely see that sort of, we're the flavor of the month, definitely. And it's like, but no, we don't want to be seen as the flavor of the month, because then what happens when the flavor changes? But I'm still here. You say, oh, well, your month has passed. You have to wait another 3 years or 4 years. And so, sort of to build structures that make sure that this continues, and there continues to be space for Africans. And it's also for the book buying public to support. I tell people all the time that, like, say, oh, we want more African authors. I'm like, well, you have to buy the books of the authors that exist, because publishing is a business. So they look at their metrics and they say, well, we wanted, we published a few books by African authors, but they're not really selling. So that's often and so sometimes that can happen, is that when people are thrust into the limelight, as it were, then there has to be support from the community, or else that investment dwindles. Let me speak the bank terminology, the loan terminology.
Yeah, so true. Please go out today and buy a book by an African author.
Yeah.
And I think that sort of speaks to one of the questions that was asked by Mubarak in the chat about just the next frontiers for African writers. So I really like this point you said about, okay, let's now make it the case where, as Africans are up and coming in the writing space, the proceeds are going back to Africa, and we're not just, putting money in the hands of other nations. Okay, so I think I would like us to answer one more question, and then I'll hand over to the moderator because I'm conscious of time. If there are actually quite a few questions, so I apologize that we weren't able to get to all of them. But just to move in a slightly different direction, we have someone asking whether you are making your living completely as a writer, or if you have a side gig, and in tandem to that, whether you have advice for up and coming writers who want to make their living from writing. I'm very interested in this.
People always ask me this question. People are missing for the first time. They ask me, like, so how much money do you make in a year as a writer? I said, your own annual salary paycheck. I don't. So yes, I do write full time, but at the same time, I also think it's important for people in the creative fields, if they feel comfortable to share the sort of financial reality. So it sort of helps people make informed decisions. So I do write full time, and I've been writing full time since 2019, so probably like 4 or 5 years now. And writing is kind of feast and famine. So there's that the story in the Bible in Genesis where, Joseph, the Pharaoh has the dream, and it's like the 7 years of plenty and the 7 years of famine. And then Joseph comes and says, well, you need to find somebody who is going to be a good manager to make sure that all that you've gotten in 7 years of plenty, you save and you store it up. So like in the 7 years of famine, then you have things stored up. And so, with writing, you get paid. So for example, for a novel, you can get paid this lump sum, but then you have to remember that the novel has taken you 3 years or 4 years to write. So that money has to last you for 3 or 4 years. So you have to be good there, just sort of very prosaic. You have to learn how to budget, you have to learn how to save, learn how to, delay gratification. Also, before I started earning enough to support myself as a writer, I had parental support. it wasn't huge, but it was there. It was there. So without it, I wouldn't have been able to. And that's just the truth. And I know not everyone is in a position to do that. And yeah, I was fortunate enough to have that. But then at the same time, but the truth is you have to learn how to manage your money, because even the most generous of Nigerian parents, which my parents are, they can't support you forever. So they cannot support you forever. So it's just like learning how to budget, learning how to cut your coat, and especially towards the earlier part of my career, when I was seeing my friends, sort of going off into sort of more corporate, sort of stable jobs, is that like, you couldn't do, there were things they could do that you just weren't able to do financially. But then also there were things you got to do with your career, like travel or meet interesting people or be on panels and all of that, that they didn't get to do with their career. So you just sort of had to like learn how to be content and enjoy what was your lot. And yeah, also just learning more to treat my career as a business, learning how to negotiate. I always ask for more money. Always.
Hope the audience is taking notes.
I always ask for more money. I write freelance.
Okay.
And so I write freelance for a lot of publications and also do stuff for radio as well. And I did a job for a radio station in America once. And they offered me X amount, I would say, for 10 minutes of radio. And it ended up being 30 minutes of radio that we did. And my husband, who works a corporate job, when I told him that the radio time had tripled, he was like, well, then just ask them for ×3. And I was like, oh, how can I do that? Possible. Well, I've already agreed. He said, yeah, but you agreed, but they changed the terms. And I think a lot of times creative people find it very difficult, very, very difficult to advocate for ourselves when it comes to money. Like we're the most easily cheated people, but being friends with people who just work normal 9-to-5 jobs, like they will not work an extra 30 minutes unless the money is coming out somewhere. Sort of, yes, and I asked them for ×3. I didn't quite get ×3, but I got very close. And it was just a lesson, sort of, that learning how to advocate for yourself and treating yourself as a business. And like, so there's the creative side of it, which, let your imagination run free and all of that. And then you put that aside and then you put your, I'm like CEO of Chibundu Inc. Like, okay, to make sure that, my ingoings and my outgoings and my expenses, and yeah, you learn sort of. I earned through a company now. I mean, this is sort of too much to go into detail here, but you just sort of learn. You have to learn about tax. You have to learn. It's just, especially when you live in this context, that you have to learn the business side as well.
Well, I hope that has answered the question for the person who asked it. And I think that was just useful financial advice for all of us, regardless of the field that we work in. I was certainly taking notes. And so at this point, I will be handing over to, I believe, Mrs. Kalango, the founder of Rainbow Book Club, to just say a few words to wrap us up. So please stay on the call. We won't take much more of your time. And again, I would just like to thank Chibundu so much for the conversation and for being with us here today. It's been really great. Thank you to the audience for the questions that you sent in. And I'll hand over to Mrs. Kalango.
Okay, Tarari, thank you. Well done. Chibundu, thank you so much. As you've said, it's over 10 years. We had you in Port Harcourt at the book festival. And here we are. Oh, no, we had you in 2014 as well, as one of the Africa 39 writers. So it's a privilege because we consider you part of the Rainbow writer. So thank you. I know you're very busy. So for making our time to be our first guest, we really appreciate it. And I want to thank everyone who's joined us today. Thank you to the Rainbow team for the dedication. It's been a wonderful conversation. I've certainly learned so much. And I could identify when Chibundu said we creatives are not so business savvy. So I picked that from you. So thank you, Chibundu. Thank you, Tarari. Osarume, over to you.
All right. Thank you so much, Mrs. K. Thank you, Tarari. Thank you, Chibundu. Really appreciate it. Thank you to our audience. I understand we are live and we've been live on Facebook, on the Port Harcourt World Book Capital 2014 page, on the Port Harcourt Book Festival page, as well as the Rainbow Book Club page on Facebook. Make sure you can catch up actually this interview on those platforms. We've also been live streaming on YouTube. And if you want to check us out on YouTube, it's called the Rainbow Book Club. Okay, it's not all together, they're separate words, Rainbow Book Club. And I know that Mrs. K wouldn't want to say this, but she is also a very accomplished person, founding many years ago the Rainbow Book Club. She is actually a member of the Order of the Niger. And this was bestowed on her, this award, as you know, very prestigious in the year 2014. She's also a Sun newspaper Creative Person of the Year. And to mention a few, she's very accomplished. She's very dedicated and committed to ensuring that we promote the reading culture in Nigeria and in Africa. And we continue to tell stories in our own words and from our own lenses or through our own lenses, just as Chibundu has been able to do with Sankofa and the many other books that she's been able to write over the years. So we look forward to many more books from you, Chibundu, and we look forward to inviting you again to another opportunity to discuss one of your new books again. But thank you very much for your time, and many thanks also to our team who've also been commenting and engaging the audience as well. Thank you for it. It's taken a whole team to make this happen. So thank you very much, everyone. We are going to be having it's a monthly book series. It's every month. So you have something to look forward to every single month of the year. So you can catch us next month on the 26th of May. We're going to be speaking to another incredible African author, very, very interesting gentleman. And he wrote a very interesting book as well. It's called Boom Boom. So I'd leave you to go do your research and find out the author of Boom Boom. Also very accomplished, also an award winner. He's going to be here discussing his book, Boom Boom. So go and check him out and come with your questions. Tell a friend, invite someone, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you, everyone, and we wish you a wonderful, wonderful weekend. Thank you once again, Tarari, for such a gracious interview with our guest author today. Bye now.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.